two fools and a wise woman. Two fools and a wise woman. So we'll get into that, and I'll explain what I mean by that here as we go through this chapter. I want to start by reading the first three verses here, 1 Samuel 25. It says, "And Samuel died, and all the Israelites were gathered together and lamented him and buried him in his house at Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose possessions were in Carmel, and the man was very great, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, and he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife Abigail, and she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance, but the man was churlish and evil in his doings, and he was of the house of Caleb." All right, so let's talk about the characters in this story. All three of them are introduced here. The chapter starts by telling us about Samuel. He's not a character in this story, but it just tells us that he died. He had been a great leader of Israel, and he was somebody that led Israel spiritually for years, and now he's passing off the scene that had to have left a void. And so that's just kind of there as a historical detail that's given to us at the beginning of the chapter. But at the end of verse 1, the first of these characters that kind of takes place in the story, no surprise, is David. And it says that David went down to Paran. So he's the first character, okay? And the last time we talked about David, remember he's on the run, and he just spared Saul's life in a cave. Remember Saul said, you're truly going to be the next king of Israel, and made him promise that he wouldn't take and kill his family and all that. But they're back to their old game again. I mean, Saul is back to chasing David, and he's back to being on the run here. The second character is introduced to us in verse number 2, and the first thing we're told about this man, before we even learn his name, is that his possessions are great. He has, he's what we'd call today loaded. Okay? He has thousands of sheep, thousands of goats. He's got this vast animal husbandry empire. He's doing pretty well for himself. And one of the things it tells us about him in verse number 3 is his name. And his name is very interesting. His name is Nabal. And what's interesting about that name is Nabal in Hebrew means fool. Imagine your mom. "Oh, hey, little baby fool." All right? He's named Fool. And the rest of the verse, and really the rest of this chapter, tells us that Nabal lives up to his name. He's not just named Fool, he is a fool. He may be rich, but he's a rich fool. He's churlish. That word means he's hard, cruel, severe, and obstinate. So he's not a nice guy. Kind of a jerk. And what's worse is it says he's evil in his doing. So he's not just stubborn and ugly. He's just a bad guy. He does bad things, this Nabal. And the last part of the verse tells us he's of the house of Caleb. This is interesting. I was looking this up, and the house of Caleb is one word. And that word Caleb also means dog. And so a lot of people, traditionally, the Jewish understanding of this verse wasn't telling us that he descended from the house of Caleb. It was saying, this guy's a dog. Now, if he did descend from the house of Caleb, maybe that's just given to us so that we see the contrast, because Caleb was a man. Caleb was awesome. He was a man of faith and wisdom, and Nabal is a fool who acts foolishly. There's a third character in the story, and she's really the star of this chapter, and she's introduced in verse 2, and her name is Abigail. This is Nabal's wife. Now, you would think Nabal, being the fool that he is, the churlish man that he is, the wicked man that he is, that he would not have gotten a very good wife. But unfortunately for Abigail, that's not the case.
The Bible tells us that she is a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. So we learn two things here about about Abigail. First, she's wise. That's what of a good understanding means. She's a very wise woman. And the second thing we learn about Abigail is that she's beautiful. She's a looker. So she's not just a trophy wife for Nabal, okay? She's not just pretty. She is unbelievably wise. She's a very wise woman. And what we're going to see in this story, the rest of the story as it unfolds, is we're going to see the two men act like fools, and Abigail, the one woman in the story, is wise and kind of saves the day. She acts beautifully. So two fools and a wise man. Well, let's talk about how Nabal was a fool first. And I want to read verses 4 to 9 here. Okay? So it says, "And David heard in the wilderness that Nabal did shear his sheep. And David sent out 10 young men. And David said unto the young men, Get you up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus shall you say to him that liveth in prosperity, Peace be both to thee, and peace be to thine house, and peace be unto all that thou hast. Now I have heard that thou hast shearers. Now thy shepherds, which were with us, we hurt them not, neither was there aught missing unto them all the while they were in Carmel. And thy young men, and they will show thee. Ask thy young men, and they will show thee. Wherefore let the young men find favor in thine eyes, for we come in a good day. Give, I pray thee, whatsoever cometh to thine hand unto thy servants, and to thy son David. And when David's young men came, they spake to Nabal according to all those words in the name of David, and ceased." So what's going on here? Why is Nabal a fool? David and his men are in the wilderness. He's got this band of hundreds of soldiers. And they just happen to be where Nabal's sheep have been grazing. Okay? Sheep were very valuable. That's why it's listed here to tell us how wealthy he was. They were very valuable. And there's thousands of them grazing. And they just happen to be grazing on the west side of Israel, right up next to where the Philistines lived. Okay? And it was common, extremely common, if you read the book of Judges, remember we're not very far removed from that, it was extremely common for the Philistines to come over the mountains and raid the Israelites and take their stuff. And so you have these huge flocks there that are basically sitting there ready to be taken by the Philistines, and David has been providing security for these people, security for this herd, and making sure that nothing was stolen, nothing was taken from them, that nobody messes with them. You can almost think of him as like an ovine security guard. Bovine refers to cows, ovine refers to sheep. You learned something new today, okay? David has been providing this valuable service to Nabal and his flocks. And apparently this has been going on for a while, and it's harvest season. And shearing was like the harvest season for the sheep, for these shepherds. And it's when they collected all of the profits. It's when they kind of brought in all of the wool, and they killed some of the sheep to eat, and they got to kind of collect from all of their work for the year. And it was traditional that at this time there would be a big feast, and there would be generosity that was shown to the people that helped. And so David sends his men very politely and very reasonably to ask Nabal for some food. He kind of brings an itemized receipt, like this is all the stuff that we did for you, okay? Will you do what's customary and help us out? He doesn't demand it. He doesn't intimidate Nabal. He didn't bring a band of soldiers. He sends some young men. They're very respectful. He's treating Nabal as a good man and expecting Nabal to act like a good man. Just looking for a tip, right, for his service. And look at how Nabal responds, verse 10. It says, "And Nabal answered David's servants and said, Who is David? And who is this son of Jesse? There be many servants nowadays that break away every man from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my flesh that I have killed for my shearers, and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be?" So David's young men turned their way and went again and came and told him all those sayings. So Nabal is a fool here, and he acts like a fool. He turns to these servants of David, and he insults David. Who is this David? Of course he knew who he was. Everybody knew who David was. Who is this son of Jesse? That was a derogatory thing for him to say. He's insinuating that David is a nobody, that David is a loser. And then he says, there's many servants nowadays that break off from their master. So he's not just saying David's a nobody, he's accusing David of being an unfaithful servant and a runaway servant. By the way, nowadays, almost never is that phrase used and something wise comes after it. So it's like, I'm pet peeve of mine. Anyways, Nabal says, shall I take my bread and my water and give it unto men whom I know not whence they be? So he's like, my bread, my water. This is the best way I can think of to illustrate what Nabal does here. Imagine you're a waiter. I used to be a waiter. And, I'm waiting in a nice restaurant. Of course, maybe you don't know this, but waiters make like no money, like a couple dollars an hour, way below minimum wage. And all of their money comes from tips. And so it's not just like customary to tip waiters, like you really need to tip your waiter. All right? And so imagine waiting at a restaurant and somebody comes in and they order this large meal and you do a good job. I mean, you keep their drinks full, you make sure their food comes to them while it's hot, you make sure that they're taken care of, you stay out of the way, but you're there watching the whole time. You are doing a good job. And then it comes time to give them the bill, and this is the time where you expect to get paid for your work. And not only does this man not give you a tip, but he writes a nasty note on the bill, and he says, I'm not giving you a tip because you just look like the kind of person that flunked out of high school, and that's why you're waiting tables, and you'd probably take the money and waste it on booze anyways. Okay? That's what Nabal did here. He was being very rude and very impolite and very unjust, and he's also being purposely insulting. So let me give you 6 ways that we can see this chapter how Nabal was a fool. And these are all things that we just need to avoid. So the first way, he was foolish in his ingratitude. David had been serving him in his interest. He just blew him off. He showed no gratitude for the valuable service that David and his men provided. I was trying to think of some scripture to illustrate this. And the verse I came to is Galatians 6:6. It says, let him that is taught in the word communicate unto him that teacheth in all good things. In that context, it's talking about the church. And it says if you're being served, you need to communicate. You need to share what you have. Hebrews 13:16 says, but to do good and to communicate, forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased. That's talking about the church. The principle applies to just life. Be grateful to people that serve you. Be grateful. God is pleased when we're grateful. Nabal shows zero gratitude, and it's one of the things that shows he's a fool. The second way he acted like a fool was he was foolish in his disrespect. David was God's man. David was the anointed. Listen, everybody in this story knows that David was the anointed. Nabal's wife knew it. Jonathan, the crown prince, recognized David as the anointed. Saul, in the last story we looked at, recognized that David was God's anointed. Everybody knows. It's not a secret. And yet Nabal looks at David and says, who's David? Who's this son of Jesse? Disrespect. Dishonor. Another way he was foolish was he was rude. He's just ugly. He could stiff David and his men and not be ugly about it, right? Like they would still probably be miffed, but I think what really bothered them is he took the opportunity to heap on and just make fun of and insult and to show his position of superiority over David. And I just want to tell you something. don't ever be rude. Don't be rude to people. Don't be insulting to people. Treat people with kindness and respect. There is no wisdom in being a jerk. All right? You might say, well, that's just the way I am. Well, change. Don't be that way. That's not what God would have you to be. So he was foolish in his ingratitude and his disrespect and his rudeness. He was foolish, number 4, in his lack of generosity. The way Nabal talked about his blessings shows that he didn't really understand where they came from. He said, am I gonna give my bread and my water to a bunch of nobodies? He sounds like the birds and Finding Nemo. Mine, right? David Guzik, writing about this, he said there are 4 kinds of riches. You can be rich in what you have. You can be rich in what you do. You can be rich in what you know. And you can be rich in who you are. I'd say Nabal only had one of those 4. And it was the lowest form of the 4. He was rich in his possessions, but he wasn't rich in who he was and what he knew and how he acted. Number 5, he foolishly put himself in a place. Another way he's a fool. He foolishly put himself in a place of attacking God's chosen servant. Do you remember in the book of Exodus and Numbers, Israel's coming through the wilderness? And remember the Moabites and the Edomites and the Ammonites? They could have helped them. They were in a position, they weren't a threat to them. They were in a position where they could have helped them. Instead, they chose to attack them. How did that work out for them? Did God vindicate the Israelites in every case, right? God takes care of his own. And God doesn't take it lightly when people attack his people when they're vulnerable. And Nabal was becoming like the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites, and that's a foolish place to be. One more way that Nabal acted like a fool, and you don't actually see it till verse 36. So look at verse 36 with me. It says, and Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he held a feast in his house, like the feast of a king, and Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunken. Okay? So the last thing, I think this is number 6, he foolishly had a party when he was in grave danger. Now, what we're going to see here in the rest of the story, spoiler alert, Nabal is about to get killed. And not just Nabal, everybody in his house is about to get whacked, all right? They are in grave danger. And the servants know it, and Abigail, his wife, knows it. And what's Nabal doing? Nabal is treating himself like a king, having a feast, and getting drunk. Okay? Just pleased with himself. Totally oblivious to the world. He was a fool. And he acted like a fool. And I think most of us probably have the wisdom, I hope we have the wisdom to not act like Nabal at all in this story, right? I'm not looking at any of you and thinking you guys are Nabals. I've met some Nabals, but they don't go to our church, praise the Lord, okay? Nabal was the first fool. The second fool we see in this story is actually David. And look with me at verse 13. Verse number 13. It says, and David said unto his men, this is after he gets the news here. David said unto his men, gird ye on every man his sword. And they girded on every man his sword. And David also girded on his sword. And they went up after David, about 400 men, and 200 abode by the stuff. David hears what happened. He hears what Nabal said. He hears what Nabal stiffed them. Right? He's insulted, and he basically says to his guys, he says, strap up, boys. Right? We're going to ride. And what's he intending to do? Nothing nice. He wasn't going to play patty cake with Nabal. He wasn't going to just egg his house or teepee his house or something. He wasn't even just going there to take by force what he felt was owed to him. He had something completely else in mind, okay? And you see it, look at verse 21. Verse 21. It says, "Now David had said, 'Surely in vain have I kept all that this fellow hath in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that pertaineth unto him. And he hath required me evil for good. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave of all that pertain to him by the morning light any that pisseth against the wall.'" Do you know what David was planning? With his 400 soldiers all strapped up and riding like the Valkyries? He was planning genocide. He was planning to ride in there and not just kill Nabal, but to kill all of the males in Nabal's household. And I'll let you figure that out, okay? David and his band of hardened soldiers are here charging at this guy's family and at his house. They're planning to kill every man in this man's household. Now, take a step back here and think about this. Remember the last story we talked about David? David was in a cave. Saul was trying to kill him. Saul comes into the cave, and David is just given this opportunity to kill Saul or capture Saul, and he couldn't do it. He had a fit of conscience about it. He wasn't gonna hurt this man. He wasn't gonna have that blood on his hands. Right? He had to talk his soldiers down. They were like, "This is your opportunity," and he had to talk them down. Right? He couldn't go through with it. That would have been wrong. But that also would have kind of been self-defense and been kind of understandable. If that story went a different way, we would have been like, "Oh, cool. God delivered Saul into David's hands." That's not at all what's going on in this chapter. If David goes in and kills Nabal and all Nabal's guys, there's no way to spin that. That's pretty bad. And he's going to do it. And if you notice, he even spiritualizes it. He even brings God into it. So listen, Nabal's not the only fool in this story. David is acting like a fool too. He has the perfect opportunity. Think about this. He has the perfect opportunity to do what we talked about on Sunday. To turn the other cheek. To leave it to God. And instead, he just goes off in this murderous rage. And he brings these men along with him. Why? His ego hurts. His pride hurts. David was a man after God's own heart. But you know what? That doesn't mean he was always a man after God's own heart. And this is an important lesson. Okay? Everybody, even the most faithful people, are men, are women. We're just flesh. And everybody has lapses in faithfulness. Everybody has lapses in faithfulness. You know what David needed? He needed somebody to step in and speak wisdom to him and keep him from committing something that would be a stain on him for the rest of his life. And thankfully, he got that. Okay? He got that. So let's talk about this person. So I said this story is about two fools and a wise woman. Let's talk about the wise woman, Abigail, and what she does. At the very beginning of the story, we're introduced to her, and we're told that she is both beautiful and very wise. And how does she enter the story? Look at verses 14 to 19. It says, "But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, 'Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to salute our master, and he railed on them. But the men were very good unto us, and we were not hurt, neither missed we anything as long as we were conversant with them when we were in the fields. They were a wall unto us, both by night and day. All the while we were with them, keeping the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what thou wilt do, for evil is determined against our master and against all his household, for he is such a son of Belial that a man cannot speak to him. The servants witness this whole thing. They witness how Nabal treats these men. And they're like, this is not good. These guys are soldiers. And he goes and finds Abigail, and he tells Abigail about how Nabal treated these guys. And they are, and they should be, afraid for their lives. And so Abigail springs into action. She gets a bunch of food together for David's men. And she very wisely and very carefully goes out to meet them. Okay? Picture this. Picture this. David and his men are just charging at this hill, going to get Nabal. It's like the, dun 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 dun. They're gonna get theirs. They're gonna take care of these guys. And they come around the hill, and they see all of these gifts, food and wine and other things that were given to them, the things that they should have got from Nabal. And then at the end of them, boom, is this beautiful woman that's bowing herself down on the ground. That would have been a startling thing. And Abigail planned it to be a startling thing. They come around this corner, and there she is. Look at verse 23. Sorry, this is not a short message, so I'm skipping over some. I'm not reading every verse here. But verse 23 says, and when Abigail saw David, she hasted and lighted off the ass and fell before David on her face and bowed herself to the ground and fell at his feet and said, upon me, my Lord, upon me let this iniquity be. And let thine handmaid, I pray thee, speak in thine audience and hear the words of thine handmaid. I'm going to read all the way down to verse 31. Let not, my Lord, I pray thee, regard this man of Belial, even Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, thine handmaid, saw not the young men of my Lord, whom thou didst send. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord liveth, and as thy soul liveth, seeing the Lord hath withholden thee from coming to shed blood, and from avenging thyself with thine own hand, now let thine enemies, and they that seek evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. And now this blessing, which thine handmaid hath brought unto my Lord, let it even be given unto the young men that follow my Lord. I pray thee, forgive the trespass of thine handmaid, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord fighteth the battles of the Lord, and evil hath not been found in thee all thy days. Yet a man is risen to pursue thee, and to seek thy soul, but the soul of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the life with the Lord thy God, and the souls of thine enemies, them shall he sling out as out of the middle of a sling. And it shall come to pass, when the Lord shall have done to my Lord according to all the good that he hath spoken concerning thee, and shall have appointed thee ruler over Israel, that this shall be no grief unto thee, nor offense of heart unto my Lord, either that thou hast shed blood causeless, or that my Lord hath avenged himself. But when the Lord shall have dealt well with my Lord, then remember thine handmaid. Wow. There's so much to be said here about how Abigail approaches David. She comes in the kindest way possible. David is in the wrong here, but she doesn't come and be like, David, get over yourself. All right, she comes and she says, listen, basically, she says, listen, David, you are a good man. You are a good man. Everybody knows you're a good man. Everybody knows you're fighting for God, and you're doing things right. You don't want blood on your hands. God is going to take care of you. God's fighting the battles for you. One day, you're going to be king. And you won't even remember when you're king what Nabal did to you. It's going to be like a distant memory, like, oh, that was cute. Right? Don't do this thing, David. Let God take care of it. What a wise word. Now, Abigail wasn't perfect. She deceived Nabal. Nabal was her husband. She probably shouldn't have done that. She probably shouldn't have said to David that her husband was a son of Belial and lived up to his name. Okay? But the overall theme of this story is not to put Abigail down. The overall theme of this story is that she acted very wisely. She was the one that God used to keep David from having blood on his hands and to show David that God would take care of him. Now, again, let's remember something. Even the best of men are men. Even the best of women are men. Or not. See, you're paying attention. We're all mankind. That's what I'm trying to say. Even a man like David, who is a man after God's own heart, that's what the Bible says about him, has lapses in faithfulness. And even a man like David, who is incredibly wise, taught Solomon much of the stuff that Solomon put in Proverbs. Just a very wise man. Even David acts like a fool sometimes. And you know what kept David from going off the rails and actually committing this murder? The wisdom of a woman. The wisdom of Abigail. And I think one of the takeaways from this story is that we need the wisdom of God's people. We need the wisdom of God's people. Okay? You might say this is a weird application for this story, but bear with me. I think it is absolutely crucial that we as believers are faithful in church and faithful in church attendance and not forsake the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, as Hebrews says. You know why? It's not just because you need to hear sermons. That's a good thing. It's not just because you need to be under the care of pastors. That's a good thing. That's something the Bible commends. It's because you need the wisdom of each other. Because there's going to come a day when you're acting foolishly. There's going to come a day when you, like David, are on the warpath, and maybe you prayed about something. You know, David brought God into this. Maybe you've prayed about something, and you think, man, this is what I'm going to do. And you are charging towards something that will be a stain on you for the rest of your life. And you need some sweet saintly lady. You need some sweet saintly old man in the church to pull you aside and say, don't do it. Don't do it. You need the wisdom of God's people and to seek the wisdom of God's people. I told you the story was about two fools and a wise woman. The two fools, of course, David and Nabal. What is the difference in this story between David and Nabal? You know, Nabal's servants, earlier in the story, call him a son of Belial. And then they said this. They said, a man can't speak to him. A man can't speak to him. Get this. Nabal is married to who? Abigail. All right. Do you think Abigail, through her marriage, tried to speak some wisdom at times and probably was wise about it, given the way she treats David? Do you think Abigail tried to speak some wisdom into Nabal's life? He didn't listen. He was a man that wouldn't listen. He just wouldn't listen to wisdom. In contrast, David, by the way, that's the characteristic of a permanent fool. A permanent fool is somebody who refuses to listen when his foolishness is pointed out. David, by contrast, encounters this woman that he does not know, who shares very wisely that he is doing wrong, and he amends his ways immediately. He immediately he learns the lesson, right? Nabal was a permanent fool, And David, like all of us can be at times, was a temporary fool. So, which one are you? You get to be a fool, right? Are you a temporary fool or a permanent fool? When you get hot, when you get angry, when your ego's hurt by something, do you run off like the ride of the Valkyries and refuse to let go of it? Or when God brings wisdom into your life, wise people, to be a speed bump, do you heed that warning? I'm going to wrap this story up here. I'll just explain what happens in the rest of the story. Abigail comes home, and Nabal is drunk. And so she waits until the morning when Nabal wakes up to tell him what she did. And he wakes up, hungover and deflated. And she tells him, and the Bible says his heart fails. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means he had a heart attack. I don't know if it just means he got super depressed. I don't know. But he just goes to bed. And he lies in bed for 10 days and dies. God took him. God killed him. And then, at the end of the story, Abigail becomes David's wife and shows the same kind of grace and wisdom as David's wife that she showed in this story. So, get this. Without David doing anything, God took care of Nabal. And not only did God take care of Nabal, God ended up giving David all that was Nabal's. Okay? Without David lifting a finger, God fought his battles for him. And so I think one of the key lessons is we need to let God take care of the Nabals. We need to let God take care of the fools. Okay? He can do it. Just like we said Sunday, we have to learn to turn the other cheek. Okay? Learn the value of listening to wisdom from others. That's what this story is about. Now, we could talk about David having multiple wives, and there's all kinds of other messy stuff that we could get into, but we're going to leave that for some other day, okay? Not tonight. Let's have a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, I pray that you'll help us to learn the lessons from this story and to learn to receive wisdom and to be wise people ourselves. Help us to understand our purpose, Lord, to be wise and look out for each other and to help each other from doing things that we can't take back and doing things that are harmful. Lord, help us to be like David in this story that learns when we're corrected instead of being like Nabal that will not listen to wisdom. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Let's take a prayer request tonight.